the pond in the US, Tesla shares were about 0.5% lower in today's session earlier on after the firm's CEO had a very abrupt U-turn on Bitcoin. Elon Musk saying the firm will not accept it for the purchase of vehicles due to the environmental cost of mining Bitcoin. This, remember, is the same firm that barely a week ago reported gains of over $101 million in its Q1 net earnings, and it's not clear how much money, if any, the firm made from car sales via Bitcoin. But now it says we're not a fan anymore. It's an interesting U-turn. Here's what's coming up next. South Africa's central bank forecast to keep rates at record lows in next week's monetary policy meeting. Nigeria's power grid shuts down yet again, causing a major outage right across the country. And the US Colonial pipeline resumes service after a crippling cyber attack. Now, we'll be talking about the latest updates on that Colonial pipeline in another 30 minutes. But our starting point at this hour is South Africa. Investors seem to be celebrating the suspension of one of South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa's main rivals within the ruling party, the ANC. The move is being seen as a sign that he's finally getting round to tightening his grip on the governing African National Congress and boosting investor confidence as well. Mr. Ramaphosa has slowly consolidated control over this divided legacy party after narrowly winning a leadership contest in December 2017 that also saw enemies elected to powerful party posts. But he only felt confident enough last week to move against the party's Secretary General Ace Magashule, who has been charged with corruption after his allies in the ANC's national executive pushed through much tougher rules for members who were charged with some serious crimes. Angelo Coppola joins us now live from Johannesburg with more data on this story. Okay, so Angelo, Magashule made this bid, this gambit to suspend the president, accusing him of violating campaign finance rules. But has that move effectively lost him whatever support he may have had within the party?
Well, Raman, without any more leaked audio or text messages from inside any NEC meetings or any other meetings like we saw last week, it's unclear what the situation is right now. The leaked audio that we did hear, which we understand has been verified and leaked, of course, as I said, during last weekend's meeting, paints a picture of a bit of a fractured organization, at least at NEC, which is National Executive Council, and National Working Committee Council level. The fact that Ramaphosa gave him a deadline and an ultimatum suggests, I'm told by analysts, that there has been a subtle shift in power to the Ramaphosa side of the ANC, which means that Ace Magashule may have lost some support. Analysts are saying that how he responds will provide a clearer picture on the level of support he has got at the moment and what his future plans might be in the future. So it's finally poised, and it's going to be a very interesting next scene in this political play, which is bound to be very dramatic, Raman.
Let's go back a little bit, though, because Magashule was in court last November, I believe. He was facing 21 charges of corruption at the time, and he was out on bail. But why did it take this long for the party to eventually tell him, hey, bruh, you've got to step aside?
Well, look, it's been a very politically charged topic, to say the least. In fact, the NEC couldn't get the wording for that new step-aside, so-called step-aside policy in place. And it had to go through a National Working Committee to vote on, and then it had to get approval. And as the ANC does, it goes through lots of consultation and went across the party lines through all the branches to get approval. And that's the manner in which they get policy change or policy enacted, by inclusion and consensus. This process, it appears, was speeded up because it became clear quite quickly that voters may turn their backs on the party at the next municipal elections, which are expected later in the year, towards October, November time. But let's also bear in mind that Magashule hasn't stepped aside yet. That is likely to happen either this evening or at the very latest tomorrow, because that's the deadline. If not, he's probably going to be ejected or fired or sacked, whichever word you choose. It's not a difficult choice, analysts say, though, because he's either going to step aside on full pay and benefits, or he's going to be sacked with nothing. So it's going to be a choice for him to make at this stage. We don't know what he's going to do, Raman.
And even, well, delving into much deeper history here, the case in November also focuses on a $40.4 million contract when he was the Premier of the Free State to survey low-income houses that had asbestos. But are there other graft cases arising from his time as Premier?
Yep, there certainly are. One case in point is at the moment a $30 million Estina Freire Farm Dairy project that you and I have spoken about regularly. It's a corruption case that's happening at the moment. The matter is currently being aired at the Zondo Commission, and that's with the ex-Mineral Resources Minister, Mosebenzi Zwane, in the starring role there. In fact, this happened during his tenure as the Agricultural Minister of the Executive Committee in the Free State. And that's while Magashule was in power. He hasn't been directly implicated in any wrongdoing at this stage. It's still early days, of course, but it did happen under his watch. And his approach during his tenure as the Free State Premier was to be very hands-on. In fact, he knew exactly what was going on in all parts of his realm, as some analysts have called the Free State during his ruling of that area there. So it's going to be an interesting situation, because while the case is almost over, or the Zondo Commission is almost finished with its investigation into it, it involves a whole range of different issues, lots of opaque transfers, lots of money that was moved out of that fund that was meant for the farm and into the now very infamous Gupta wedding at Sun City. People were involved there, lots of ministers were in attendance. So it's going to be a rather interesting play out as we watch this thing develop, and as we watch the NPA get involved and start preferring charges. Ramah.
Indeed, certainly an interesting story to follow. Angela Kopla in Johannesburg, thank you. Now, South Africa's Reserve Bank will keep its repo rate unchanged next week, as inflation remains pretty much within the bank's comfort range, despite showing signs of quickening a little bit in recent months. All 25 economists surveyed this week said that the central bank would essentially keep its policy rate at a record low, 3.5%, in its next rate-setting meeting that's scheduled for the 20th of May. Economists said that while global inflation forecasts are drifting higher, domestic inflation forecasts are still very comfortably within the range set by the South African Reserve Bank. South Africa aims to keep its inflation rate anywhere between 3 to 6%. Now, the World Bank has signed a $500 million infrastructure project financing facility with the Democratic Republic of Congo. The money is designed to help improve roads, mitigate flood risks, fight erosion and develop public spaces across the capital, Kinshasa. The lender said that the funding for the Kin-Elenda project, as it's known, is basically split into two, in a credit and a grant tranche, each of $250 million. Kinshasa is the largest French-speaking city in the world. It's home to over 17 million people. The World Bank's country director, Jean-Christophe Carré, says that Kin-Elenda will help change the daily lives of the people of Kinshasa through the investments it will make throughout the city. Another Bretton Woods institution, this time the International Monetary Fund, wants authorities in Zambia to implement agreed-to policies before resuming talks on a long-awaited economic program that has held up debt restructuring talks with external creditors. Now, that in turn has dealt a blow to bondholders' hopes for an agreement before the country goes to general elections in August, in the country that has become Africa's first pandemic-era sovereign default. An IMF bailout is absolutely crucial for Zambia before it can reach any kind of restructuring agreement with the holders of as much as $12.74 billion in external public debt. At least $3 billion of that is just held up in Eurobonds. Analysts say that the government will probably only be willing to implement these reforms after the elections, and the talks over a deal may drag on until the end of the year. Still in Southern Africa, Malawi's President Lazarus Chakwera has warned that the country's lead foreign exchange earner, that's tobacco, is in terminal decline. Chakwera is now urging for a switch to cannabis and other high-value crops instead. Tobacco is expected to bring in roughly $200 million in foreign currency earnings this year. That's roughly similar to what it brought in the last 2 years, but it's well below previous annual earnings of up to $350 million. Chakwera said that aside from tobacco, the agricultural sector is booming and it will enable economic growth, estimated at almost 4% this year based on the latest forecasts. But decades of public health education have gradually convinced people around the world about the dangers of tobacco. Malawi's parliament passed a bill last February, in fact, just making it legal to cultivate and process cannabis for medicines and hemp fiber used in industry. All right, then let's make a quick run through some company headlines, starting in banking. South Africa's ABSA expects a tenfold profit jump for the 6 months ending in June 30th, citing cost controls and a reduction in bad debt. The bank reported headline earnings per share, which is the country's most commonly used profit measure, of 67.7 cents in the same period last year. One of South Africa's top 4 banks, ABSA, is bouncing back from some rather hefty provisions taken last year due to the pandemic. Over in East Africa, Kenya's largest telecoms operator, Safaricom, saw its earnings before interest and taxes slide to $899 million in the year ending in March, weighed down, of course, by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The firm is partly owned by South Africa's Vodacom and the UK's Vodafone. It had reported earnings before interest and taxes of over $945 million the previous year. The telecoms operator expects core earnings to return to growth this year, buoyed by a recovery in the company's financial services platform M-Pesa and a focus on increasing its 4G network coverage. And Tesla, as we mentioned earlier, has suspended vehicle purchases using Bitcoin due to climate change concerns. That's according to the company's CEO Elon Musk in his preferred medium, Twitter. Bitcoin fell by more than 10%. After that tweet, Tesla shares also dipped. Now, Tesla's announcement back in March that it would accept the cryptocurrency was met with outcry from some environmentalists and investors. Not groups you often see working together. The electric car maker had in February revealed that it bought $1.5 billion, or the world's largest digital currency, but on Thursday, it's backtracked on its enthusiasm around the cryptocurrency. Musk said the car maker will not sell any of its Bitcoin holdings and intends to use it for transactions as soon as mining shifts to more sustainable energy sources. And finally, Boeing has gotten approval from U.S. aviation authorities for proposed fixes to an electrical problem that grounded a portion of its deeply troubled 737 MAX fleet for more than a month. The 737 MAX plane was initially grounded in March 2019 after a pair of crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration cleared the fleet to fly again in November, but last month, Boeing said it had notified 16 airlines and other clients of a potential electrical problem with these birds, and it recommended that they temporarily stop flying some of the planes. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's on the other side. Zimbabwe's government approves a strategy to scale up local manufacturing of pharmaceutical drugs. And we'll take a look at the latest bilateral agreement between China and Tanzania and the effect it may have on both sides.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Let's head over to West Africa. Nigeria's power grid is shut down again, resulting in a major outage in many parts of the country. Africa's most populous nation has been struggling for years now with irregular power supply. And this is despite repeated government promises to stabilize the grid. Correspondent Tessa Makende reports from Jos.
The transmission company of Nigeria, TCN, says the national grid experienced a total system collapse on Wednesday. TCN General Manager Public Affairs Ndidi Mba says the cause of the voltage collapse that led to the outage is currently being investigated. In the meantime, she's calling for patience from citizens and says work has already started on restoring the grid. Last month, Nigeria also suffered a major power outage after 16 out of 28 power generating plants either suffered a breakdown, experienced gas shortage, or required maintenance. In February, the national grid experienced partial collapse, leading to power outage in many parts of Nigeria, including Lagos and Abuja. The country's power generation capacity is around 13,000 megawatts, but only an average of about 4,000 to 5,000 megawatts is distributed across the country. According to the Association of Nigerian Electricity Distributors, the country requires close to 200,000 megawatts of electricity for its over 200 million population. The Ministry of Power has reiterated its promises to diversify the country's energy sources away from hydro and gas generated to other sources like solar, as well as rectify the recurring electricity problems and restore better power supply soon. Tessem Akende, CGTN Jos, Nigeria.
On to South Africa, the wine industry there is pinning its hopes on a recovery on COVID-19 vaccines. The industry collectively has been badly battered by lockdown restrictions and liquor consumption bans in the last year. Here's Sumitra Naidu with the details.
Wine tourism contributed over $171 million to the South African economy in 2019. This number is tripled when taking into account the indirect and induced contribution to GDP. It's become an important industry and forms a big chunk of overall tourism in the country, which is why stakeholders are feeling the impacts of COVID.
We have estimated financial losses of roughly 8.5 billion rand, as well as roughly 22,000 job losses in our industry. And that stretches also way beyond just the wine industry, all the way through hospitality, events, and even the transport sector, as well as manufacturing of glass for the bottles and packaging.
The liquor bans have been lifted and lockdown restrictions eased, but COVID remains a real threat. While domestic tourism is open, foreign arrivals to South Africa dropped by over 70%. The wine industry in South Africa is banking on the vaccination programs already underway in most European countries to see a strong rebound in overseas travellers.
The rollout of the vaccine is very important for the South African wine industry. Not only does it mean tourism can return to the Western Cape, where those all-important cellar door sales to tourists are so important to our producers, but also for our locals to be able to travel to our international markets where they can promote and sell their wines to agents, buyers, importers.
South Africa's own rollout may take much longer. Phase 1 of the vaccination drive is still underway. Over 500,000 healthcare workers will need to get vaccinated before the rollout enters Phase 2.
I think it remains to be seen how successful our vaccine rollout is going to be. Currently, South Africa is very highly on the list of no travel countries or with travel warnings against it. So I think as soon as our vaccine rollout takes effect and we can show that this can be done effectively and efficiently, we're expecting an influx of tourism.
Since COVID-19 reached our shores, there's been 3 liquor bans in South Africa. The wine industry on its own lost $530 million.
Exports made up for some of the losses, but the liquor bans and COVID restrictions at the ports still left a surplus of 400 million bottles of wine.
At the moment, the industry is looking forward to the future. We've just had a very successful harvest following a year of very good rains during our rainy season, and our winemakers are all busy in their cellars.
Wine tasting and accommodation in the Western Cape makes up the bulk of wine tourism in South Africa. This industry accounts for 34,000 direct and indirect jobs, all of which depends largely on foreign tourism, which hopefully rebounds soon as people get vaccinated here and abroad. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Zimbabwean authorities have approved a 5-year strategy to scale up local manufacturing of pharmaceutical drugs. The government over there is targeting to raise local production capacity to at least meet 60% of domestic demand by 2025. At the moment, roughly 80% of the drugs available in the country are imported, either through private pharmacies or health development partners. CGTN's Farai Mokotuya takes up the story.
George Chagonda has come to the Epilepsy Support Foundation to collect a monthly batch of free drugs for his teenage son who suffers from epileptic seizures. The donated medication is often inadequate.
Sometimes I can only get one type of medication, yet my son needs 2 types, so I have to try to find the other one myself. Pharmacies are now selling in US dollars, which makes them harder to afford.
The bulk of medicines available in Zimbabwe are imported because local production has been progressively whittled down by years of economic distress.
Currently, I think about 20% of the national drug requirements are being met by local industries. But again, they are still reeling.
That may change with the implementation of an ambitious pharmaceutical development strategy, which will be financed by a $45 million revolving fund that manufacturers can tap into.
What the industry is asking for is long-term funding, 5 to 10 years, at concessionary interest rates, which is payable over a period of 5 to 10 years. And it is very important to have that money available because the funding that is available from commercial banks is short-term and the interest rates of about 40% and above. And that is not conducive for any meaningful investment. So what we're asking for is what has been done, for example, in agriculture, what has been done in mining, and have the same facility available for the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry.
Beyond capitalizing the drug makers, the strategy also aims to increase the availability of critical raw materials.
It means the millers have to be capacitated and equipped to actually start making cornstarch, which is pharmaceutical grade. Same thing with our sugar refineries. They actually need to refine the sugar to pharmaceutical grade. So it's the feeder industries and those who feed into this into the raw material supply will need to ramp up their strategies and to actually start thinking that we are working at pharmaceutical production.
Linkages with local universities will be created to undertake research and development that will ensure the industry keeps up with medical advancements. Restoring Zimbabwe's pharmaceutical production capacity is not only good for the economy, it's also a public health imperative that will help the country manage disease burdens, including HIV/AIDS, malaria, and increasingly prevalent non-communicable diseases. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
On to East Africa, where China and Tanzania have signed a bilateral economic and technical agreement in Dar es Salaam. China's ambassador to the country and Emmanuel Tutuba, the Tanzanian permanent secretary in the finance ministry, signed the deal on behalf of their respective governments on Wednesday. Now, the economic and technical cooperation agreement is worth roughly $15 million. The grant will be used to implement various projects to be agreed to by both countries' governments. The two countries do have some strong economic ties. On to North Africa, Muslims around the world are celebrating Eid Al-Fitr this week. That's the festive few days that follow the holy month of Ramadan. Kak is a sweet that's popular with Muslims during this period. Here's Yasser Kim taking a look at the festive treat and its origins.
The sugar-coated sweet is the main reward after a month of fasting during Ramadan. Shops prepare for it from early on.
We begin preparations a month before. The first 10 days of Ramadan, we start preparations and buying the ingredients. We then begin production, and in the last 10 days of Ramadan, we start selling the kak for the Eid.
Traditionally, families bake it at home, but now most prefer ready-made deliveries.
We bring flour, the kak flavor and fragrance, ghee and sesame. We mix it thoroughly until it is blended together. We then add water, sugar and yeast and mix it all. When it holds itself and is strong, we make the familiar rounded shape and then heat it in the oven for 25 to 30 minutes.
Kak dates all the way back to ancient Egyptian times. It's shaped like a sun with its rays because queens used to offer it to the priests as respect for the sun god Ra 4,000 years ago. Later, Egyptian rulers would stuff it with gold coins and hand it out to the poor during Eid. Since then, it has become a tradition to consume it during the Eid holidays. But in the last 2 years, COVID has had its effects on the demand for the popular sweet.
Before the coronavirus, demand was huge. Last year was tough because the curfew was at 5 p.m, so sales dropped. This year sales are a bit better, but we hope it would improve in the future.
But one thing's for sure, it will remain a main component in these annual festivities. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
We're fast approaching 18:30 GMT. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. The Facebook-backed crypto project Diem to launch a US-based stablecoin in a major shift in strategy. And Chinese companies continue to list on American markets at a record-breaking pace despite tensions between the world's two largest economies.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant.
Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what do you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
I try to not let it affect me, but there are days when it does. I'm a human being, and to see patients in a hospital bed and their family members are not there, there's no one there to hold their hand, that human touch, you know?
I just hope everyone can remember that the situation is not permanent and that everything will get better eventually.
Welcome back. These are some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. A joint military operation between Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo that aims to defeat Islamist rebels is underway. According to the Congolese government, the armies from both countries are setting up an operations hub in the DR Congo's eastern end for a joint offensive. The latter, the rebel strategies, are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of people in the last year. On Sunday, a delegation from the Ugandan People's Defence Force arrived in Beni in the DR Congo's North Kivu province to build up the command centre. That delegation includes the commander of Uganda's detachment. On to North Africa. Tunisia's Prime Minister has called for an increase in COVID-19 vaccinations targeting all vulnerable groups in the country. At the same time, the Tunisian Scientific Committee designed to combat this pandemic has urged the Health Ministry to ensure that at least 1 million elderly persons are vaccinated before the end of this month. Tunisia has recorded over 320,000 cases of COVID-19 to date. At least 11,400 people have succumbed so far to the virus. On to West Africa, the Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari has approved new security measures for parts of the country that have experienced deadly attacks on security forces in recent weeks. The Acting Inspector General of Police, Usman Al-Kalibaba, announced the measures on Tuesday after a National Security Council meeting at the presidential villa in Abuja, but he declined to give specific details. Now, this meeting comes on the heels of attacks on security officials and citizens in a West African oil producer. And the UK has imposed sanctions against Libya's Kaniat militia. It says that those who breached international law in the North African state will have to face consequences. According to the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, the Kaniat militia has overseen a 5-year reign of terror all the way up to 2020. The militia group is accused of torturing and murdering innocent people throughout its reign. That's a run through your headlines. All right, then a quick run through some macro data coming through from other parts of the world. The United States consumer prices went up by the most in nearly 12 years in April. This came amidst booming demand amidst a reopening economy pushed against supply constraints. And for some, they see this as a factor that could add fuel to financial market fears of a lengthy period of high inflation. A report from the Labour Department also showed a strong build-up of underlying price pressures, and that extended a stock sell-off on Wall Street. Now, most economists, however, were unwavering in their belief that the surge in prices is temporary, noting that the main drivers of this bigger-than-expected inflation increase are hotels and airlines, industries that were hardest hit by the pandemic. Bottlenecks in the supply chain, which led to a record jump in prices of used cars and trucks last month, are expected to ease. At the same time, the U.S. Treasury says that the deficit for the first 7 months of the 2021 fiscal year hit a new record, $1.9 trillion. That's a 30% increase from the same year in fiscal 2020. Signs, of course, the government spent big in fighting the pandemic. However, the monthly balance sheet looked better as the economy did rebound. April alone recorded a deficit of about $230 billion. That's down 70% from the same period last year, which was the first full month of pandemic lockdown measures in the United States. The digital currency group Diem Association, formerly known as Facebook's Libra project, has unveiled plans to launch a dollar-linked stablecoin as it scales back its global ambitions to focus more on the United States. Now, the group is made up of 26 financial firms and non-profits. It is relocating its main operations from Switzerland to the United States, and it's withdrawing its payment system license application with a Swiss financial regulator. DM Networks US, which is a unit of the association, will run a blockchain-based payment system that will allow real-time transfer of DM stablecoins. It will also register as a money services business with the Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Now, speaking of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin did pop back up above $50,000 in Asian trade on Thursday. It clawed back some of the 17% plunge that followed Elon Musk's announcement that Tesla will stop accepting the digital tokens as payment for any of its cars. Now, the price of the world's largest cryptocurrency dropped after that announcement from around $54,800 all the way down to $45,700. That's the lowest since the 1st of March in just under 2 hours following the tweet. It recovered about half of that drop early in the Asian session and last traded around $51,099. Ether, the world's second largest cryptocurrency, also followed a similar pattern. It was down 14% to a low of 3,550, bouncing back about 4,000 a little later on. The digital currency, however, is still 30% higher than before Tesla's February announcement. In the meantime, the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee has passed a bill that will effectively ban American federal workers from installing the popular short video app TikTok onto government-owned devices. Now, the move follows a similar measure from the U.S. Senate last August. The app is deeply popular among young people, but it's come under intense scrutiny in the country over security concerns due to its links to its Chinese parent company ByteDance. TikTok is tried to distance itself from ByteDance so far with relatively mixed success. Now, the operator of the biggest fuel pipeline in the United States has announced that it will resume operations after a 5-day closure. A ransomware cyber attack forced Colonial pipeline to shut down the main part of its network on Friday. It's an 8,900-kilometer long pipeline, runs from Texas all the way to New York. It's a critical part of the U.S. petroleum infrastructure. It transports roughly 2.5 million barrels every day of gasoline, diesel fuel, heating oil and jet fuel all the way to the East Coast. Now, that closure saw supplies tighten across the U.S., with prices rising and a number of states declaring an emergency. Colonial Pipeline warned in a press release that it could take several days for delivery supply levels to return to their normal points. U.S. petrol prices did rise on Wednesday as motorists queued up to fill their cars on the 6th day of this outage. All right, then, so let's get an update on exactly what is the latest here with John Terrett. He joins us now live from New York. John, so what's the latest with the operations of this pipeline?
Well, Ramah, isn't this the story that just keeps on giving? Oh, my goodness me. And I have some breaking news for your program. So your viewers are going to hear now for the very first time what President Biden has said within the last 2 hours, because around about almost exactly 2 hours ago, he appeared in the White House and he had the following to say, and that was that at that moment of speaking, 12:30 Eastern Time, the pipeline was back on, it was up and running full time again, and he made the point that in its entire lifetime this is the first time that this pipeline has been shut down. It's never been shut down before, and that is why it's taken 6 days to get back up. Now, he also said that it would take a while for the petrol, or the gas as the Americans call it, to get back into gas stations at places where there are now shortages like North Carolina and Virginia and Georgia. I have to tell you that those shortages are caused by panic buying. There never was a shortage of fuel to go into vehicles, but people bought so much of it, fearing that there would be a problem, that now there actually is. The president said that drivers should not panic. He said this is only temporary. It'll be back up and running, and the gas will be back in the gas stations again by the weekend or by early next week. And he also was asked quite directly, have you ruled out a retaliatory attack, meaning a retaliatory cyber attack? And the president looked straight into the camera and he said no. He did say, however, that he was confident that President Putin was not involved. Now, Ramah, I have to tell you that unfortunately we've just lost the link to Nairobi, so I'm going to continue talking and you can just cut me off whenever you'd like to. I think it's worth pointing out that there is a lot of reporting here in America right now about the ransom that may well have been paid by the Colonial Pipeline Company. Now, initially it was said no ransom had been paid, or at least it was played down. Now, Bloomberg and a number of other outlets are reporting that a $5 million ransom was paid, and President Biden again was asked directly right at the end of the news conference about that. Was there a ransom paid? And he said no comment. And Ramah, as you know, when a politician says no comment, that almost certainly means yes. So I think you could take that to the bank quite probably. Now, what do we know about the people behind this cyber attack on the pipeline known as the Dark Side? Well, we know that they are a shadowy East European group. They themselves say that they're apolitical, that they're only interested in making money. We think that they are actually based in Russia. They're named either after the Star Wars Dark Side, you know, Darth Vader and all that, or a character in one of the DC comics who used to fight Superman in the early days of that particular comic strip. Now, the Dark Side have said we have attacked at least 3 other companies that we don't know about. I think it's interesting because corporations in America may be beginning to admit when they're being hacked now, because I think in the early days they were very cautious about that. They didn't want to damage their brand. But now I think a bit more transparency is happening. President Biden said, I think I read the FBI report correctly. They don't think he was involved, meaning President Putin. And he said that he will talk to President Putin about this issue when they meet at the NATO summit coming up in June in Brussels. And one last thing, there have been a number of different cyber attacks that we've been made aware of. At Oldsmar in Florida, near Tampa on the Gulf Coast back in February, somebody turned up the amount of sodium hydroxide in the water system there, potentially poisoning 14,000 people. We had the SolarWinds attack, of course, in the election, which attacked Microsoft Corporation and many US government institutions. And I think it is very clear now that a lot more has to be done. This dystopian future that we faced only via novels or via Hollywood seems now to be coming true in many ways. But President Biden, in that press conference 2 hours ago, said, I can't dictate what private companies do regarding their cybersecurity. He said, I think the federal government can add value. And Ramah, I think in conclusion, this is a very, very significant story, and we're going to be hearing about this again and again, not just here in the United States, but in Europe, potentially in China, and also in countries and cities right across Africa. Ramah, back to you in the studio.
Indeed, we'll leave it there for the time being. John Terry, it's pretty comprehensive there in New York. Now, we're still in the United States, though. American households are putting a lot more of their money into equities than ever before. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic causing economic havoc right across the country, more and more people have started trading, and markets have been climbing steadily since last spring. Charles Gibson has that report.
Coronavirus lockdowns emptied the streets around the New York Stock Exchange last year, but the virus didn't stop retail investors from piling into stocks.
We make investments morning, noon, and wait, what time is it exactly?
There's been a surge of interest in platforms like Robinhood, which allows any adult with a bank account and an internet connection to start trading. According to data from the Federal Reserve and JP Morgan, equities now make up 41% of US households' total financial assets, a record high.
And when you see stocks going up $20, $30, $40, $100 a day, it's going to attract attention. And that's what you saw. I mean, there was tremendous volatility, stocks moving up. All you had to do was jump in at any level, throw the darts, and you were up, up, up. And that's what a bull market is.
Wall Street and retail investors have been cashing in on that bull market, with the Dow Jones and the Nasdaq both climbing steadily since March last year. The Biden administration has already passed a $2 trillion coronavirus relief package and wants to pass another $4 trillion for infrastructure and jobs. With that massive stimulus and current market conditions, some Wall Street investors believe a stock market bubble is developing. For some analysts, though, that 41% figure isn't necessarily a sign that markets are overheating.
Only about 50 to 60% of Americans own stocks, and the vast majority of those are from retirement plans. Only a relatively small percentage of Americans actually own stocks directly. So actually, regardless, the allocation to stocks will increase for all Americans simply because the markets have been making record highs.
If there is a market correction on the horizon, retail investors who started trading during the pandemic could suddenly find themselves in a very different ballgame. Giles Gibson for CGTN in Washington.
Despite ongoing tensions between the world's two largest economies, Chinese firms do continue to list on American markets at a record-breaking pace. CGTN's Zhang Junfeng speaks to one investor to find out why.
When Q&A site Zhihu listed on the New York Stock Exchange on March 26, they were the 18th Chinese company to go public in the US for the first quarter of this year. That's half of all foreign listings in the country so far. And there are more coming. Some 40 companies in China are expected to list in the US this year, which could make 2021 the busiest ever IPO year for Chinese companies.
US market is still the most actually matured market in the whole world. Not only on the supervision level, but also on the investor level. The money supply is still pretty sufficient in the coming year or next.
Lighthouse Capital is a leading Chinese financial advisor involved in the US listing of Zhihu, the Hong Kong IPO of Bilibili, and a number of Chinese companies. The past decade has seen Chinese technology, consumer and entertainment companies emerge and grow, and after being financed by venture capital and private equity funds, they are now ready to raise funds directly from the public.
Given the fact that China is the first one to take the COVID situation under control last year, it helped Chinese economy to recover very, very fast. I think the fastest in the whole world. The whole Chinese market captured a great benefit of the fast-growing mobile internet. So that brings a lot of opportunities to the Chinese entrepreneurs.
Chinese officials pointed to a lack of communication and inherent bias is one of the problems between the two countries. And the growing number of Chinese companies listing in America offers investors a chance to understand the country and benefit from its economic success.
We see a great trend. A lot of US-based institutional investors come to China, set up an office, and to see more and more Chinese deals to want to capture this opportunity. For example, Tiger Global used to be only in the United States, but they set up an office right across the hall of our office. So that's definitely a good example of how US investors are paying more attention to the Chinese companies.
Last year, the US Congress passed a law that will result in the financial audits of overseas companies, including Chinese ones. Non-compliance will result in a delisting. That's one of the reasons behind the secondary listings in Hong Kong for some Chinese companies like Baidu.
Hong Kong is also a pretty mature market with a lot of investors actually quite understand Chinese business because they share the same culture, they share the same thoughts, so brings the Hong Kong market more attractive to more and more Chinese companies.
Zheng Junfeng, CGTN, Beijing.
All right, then a quick update on commodity prices. Brent crude is having a rather curious day. It's actually down around 3.4% in the last 15 minutes, also approaching the high 65 levels at this point. 2021 also a rather remarkable year for copper, partly because of all the demand coming through with regard to demand for EVs in the first place. The commodity has gone over the $10,000 a ton mark. It stayed there so far for at least a week so far. Last time we saw prices of this sort was back in 2011. Here's what's coming up next. Still to come, we'll tell you why nomads in Tunisia welcome the spring season.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Syria,
Juba,
Johannesburg,
Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Panater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival, and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back to the program. Let's over to North Africa, along the border specifically between Tunisia and Libya, where informal trade agreements have led to a rather tight-knit border economy. The onset of the spring season marks the start of their annual sheep shearing festival in the region. As that in charge now reports, the farmers collect the wool, which is then sold at the local market.
On the first day of the Spring Festival, hundreds of men gather at dawn and pray.
These Tunisian tribesmen belong to different tribes who live in the region of Bingerden, near the border with Libya. It takes several hours to collect the animals from the desert dryland pastures and to count the sheep.
Sheep breeding is part of our culture in this region. Many tribesmen, especially nomads, believe it's a sacred animal which we must take care of and protect. In the past, it was the only source of milk, food, and the sole way of earning a living. The Spring Festival marks the beginning of the Sheep Sharing Festival. It's an exceptional period of joy and fun.
On shearing day, the barn is cleaned and the sheep legs are tied up. Professional sheep shearers are hired for this difficult task. They take turns singing while shearing the woolly animal with scissors. This operation requires skill so that the sheep is shorn efficiently and quickly without causing cuts or injury.
I've learned these skills from my ancestors. Usually when I start working, I don't have time for cutting a sheep fleece while the shearing is going on. If I see a patch that is too felted or soiled to be of use, I will put it aside. Otherwise, most of the wool goes into the bag to be scattered later.
Farmers collect the wool which is sold at the local market. However, many merchants who sell wool to manufacturers of woolen products are struggling. Wool's popularity has been in decline in the North African country since the 1990s. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic has added problems that businesses can ill afford.
The wool market is facing unprecedented difficulties due to the general lockdown, which prevents middlemen from selling the merchandise in other cities. Tons of wool are lying unsold in depots. This unusual situation has pushed prices down. Revenues are likely to be significantly reduced this season.
The economy of border regions with Libya is based on trade. These large swaths of arid and hostile areas become welcoming in the month of May, which marks the annual season of the Spring Shearing Festival. The spring celebrations will last several days. This annual event attracts singers, musicians, and domestic tourists. People in the desert of Bingerden have celebrated the Spring Festival, despite the movement restrictions imposed for COVID-19 control. Now Tunisian sheep breeders are calling on the Agriculture Department and the Tunisian Confederation of Trade, Industry and Handicrafts to facilitate the sale and distribution of good quality fleece, which is produced in the border regions. Aden Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Last story for the hour comes to you from Zimbabwe. Authorities over there say they may carry out a mass culling of elephants for the first time since the 1980s. The culling would be a way to reduce the number of jumbos whose population has exceeded the carrying capacity of the land they inhabit. From Harare, here's CGTN's Farai Makotoya.
There are an estimated 100,000 of these lumbering pachyderms in Zimbabwe, 3 times what the country can manage, according to government, which is considering culling to defuse a ticking time bomb.
The challenge really we are facing is that if we don't take any action now or anytime soon, we will be faced with a situation where these animals will die in large numbers because of starvation. So it's something that is of concern to us, because now we have these huge populations which we cannot sustain. And that's where we then say culling has become a viable option now, a real option.
However, some wildlife activists dispute the official figures.
Elephants are free-range animals. They move from one country to the other along the conservation transfrontiers, right? You find that elephant moves from Zimbabwe to South Africa through the Limpopo conservation transfrontier, from Hwange to Botswana through the Kavango Zambezi conservation transfrontier. So what is it that we are calling Zimbabwean animals?
Activists say the Parks and Wildlife Management Authority should not hide behind poor resourcing as an excuse for failing to manage the jumbos.
They should be able to approach the international community for conservation funds. The money is there. What they need is to improve on is to be transparent and accountable on how those funds are managed.
Government says adverse reactions to the mooted cull are too hasty.
We have our scientists looking into it so that they then inform us on the specific approaches that we can take if they recommend that we go that route. Our decisions are always scientific. We give the experts room and support for them to then give us advice.
Previously, Zimbabwe has translocated wildlife abroad as a means to lower numbers, but the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES, has tightened regulations on the destinations to which it can move animals. That's left the country with limited options to deal with the growing number of jumbos which are increasingly coming into conflict with human beings. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Right, then a quick run through the currencies. The South African rand continued its strong run of gains against the American dollar. 14.0624 is the strongest, in fact, that we've seen so far in today's session. In East Africa, Kenya's weekly debt auction went to plan pretty much. The state raised 85% of the 224 million target that it had. Most of the proceeds from that are covering redemptions due on existing short-term debt. On the crypto side, Bitcoin was down about 7.4% to $50,426. Ethereum, second largest cryptocurrency by market value, about 6% lower to about 38.52. But even at those levels, Ethereum has had a fantastic run all year. It's up at least 400% in 2021 alone. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. Anyways, to get your feedback back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today's up next from Washington, D.C.